Morning everybody, happy Monday. It's a new week, and although I am excited and I'm energetic, I definitely need some coffee. So join me just for 2 seconds here. There we go. People always make fun of me because I like to have a spoon and I like to stir my coffee even though I have it black. Don't judge me, it's fine. Happy Monday! There it is, okay, we're ready. So immersion is a long time buzzword in the language learning world. And many people associate immersion with sort of directly going to a country where the language that you're learning is widely spoken. But who says that you have to go to another country just to have an immersive experience in another language? Well, you don't. And so today I'm going to tell you all about how to create wonderfully immersive language experiences from wherever you are by creating what I call immersion bubbles. Now, for those of you who followed my month of daily language learning diary videos, which by the way, they were splendid. What a great month that was. Well, on day 2 of that series, I told a story of one of my favorite memories in language learning, which was back when I created a really robust French immersion bubble. And so if you want to have me sort of paint you a picture of what this looks like in practice and what it looked like for me in that particular example, then I recommend you go and check out that video, which I'll link in the description and it'll be here floating. But in this video, as I promised back then, we're gonna actually be talking a lot more concretely about the process that you can go through to create an immersion bubble for yourself. And a lot of this information is gonna be coming from the book that I wrote, How to Maintain Languages. Oh my God, if you haven't read it, I think you probably should. I think you'd love it. But don't worry, I'm gonna share the whole shebang with you today. I'm not gonna hold anything back. So let's jump into what actually is an immersion bubble. So essentially, creating an immersion bubble for a language that you're learning simply means making that language a central part of your life. It means gradually restructuring your daily routine, your habits, the activities that you engage in, and doing those in the language that you're learning. If I'm an English speaker who's learning Japanese, for example, then it's very much like creating a sort of Japanese micro environment within my English-speaking macro environment that I live in. So let's talk about the steps you can take to actually achieve this. Now, the first group of things here are going to be centralized around the media that you consume. So one example here is podcasts. So if you like to listen to podcasts, then a great thing to do is find podcasts that not only are in the language that you're learning, but that hopefully also intersect with the subject matter that you find interesting. And so you can switch that activity over time to the language. Now, this could also be for reading books. Now, these could be fictional books, non-fiction books. This could also just be reading articles online, reading blog posts. Now, if you're on this platform of YouTube, then you might also look into finding YouTubers that speak the language you're learning and that maybe even talk about things that you're interested in. Another one is music. Now, while I don't necessarily think that listening to music in a foreign language is going to be a game changer, it might not necessarily make a huge, massive, impactful difference on your actual language skills, but a large part of creating an immersion bubble it's also just the general environment. It's about surrounding yourself and creating this sort of atmosphere. And so there are some things that you can do that are not necessarily specifically to create a huge impact on your language skills, but it's more just about helping to really solidify that environment that you're building for yourself. Another idea is actually using sticky notes to label things around your home. Now, again, I don't necessarily think this is gonna make a massive difference, but if you're someone who likes to cook and you wanna sort of, maybe you label things in your kitchen in the language that you're learning, and again, these are just sort of like nice things that you can do that I think they all just sort of help to keep you in the bubble, and they give you these sort of like mental sort of trigger points or emotional triggers that when you go to the kitchen, you're reminded, oh yes, that's right, I'm in a Japanese immersion bubble right now. Now, going back to media that you consume, of course, you could try to start building a stockpile of movies in the language that you're learning, or TV shows. Documentaries are a personal favorite of mine. I absolutely love watching documentaries in languages that I'm learning, and especially, of course, if I have access to subtitles in the original language. So I think you get the idea here. The point is that taking all these different things in your life that you currently do on a daily or weekly basis and making those over time sort of into the language that you're learning or that you want to immerse yourself in. Now, I want to give a really important point of caution here. Now, this is something that a lot of people may disagree with me on. In fact, I know that people do disagree with me on this, but I think that's totally okay, and I think it's important for me to still express the way that I feel about it, because this point of caution has helped a lot of people that I worked with in the past. So as I discussed in that episode of my daily language diary where I told the story of my French immersion bubble, for me, creating these bubbles, it doesn't necessarily mean going completely cold turkey on my native language, and it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not gonna look at any other languages, I'm not gonna still study French or Italian. It doesn't mean that at all. That's why I described it as making this particular language a central part of your life. So it's central, but it doesn't mean that it's the only thing in your life. Now, I often like to think of this with the analogy of an organ transplant. So an organ transplant is an incredibly stringent process that has to be done very gradually, because if you do it too fast, then there's a risk of the body completely rejecting the new organ. Now, in the case of language learning and immersion, I call this immersion burnout, and it's a very real thing that happens to lots of people. And so while I do believe it's an incredibly effective technique, this sort of 100% mass immersion, sort of AJAT style, if you're familiar with all Japanese all the time. The reason why I'm giving this point of caution is that, as you will probably know, all of my content is geared towards what is likely to work for almost all people. What is sort of general purpose, practical, really enjoyable, sustainable advice that I can give that I really have seen work for most people. And most people I have seen try to go completely cold turkey and just absolutely go full immersion on a language that they're learning, and they're determined to listen to everything in Japanese all the time, and not speak English. Personally, I've seen a lot of people try that, and I've seen almost nobody, in my personal experience, who actually was able to stick with it. And on the contrary, I've seen it have a very damaging impact on a lot of those people's language learning, because you can actually get very burned out, and it can lead to being very, very discouraged. And I've seen people just stop learning Japanese, for example, because they just burned themselves out so hard. Furthermore, I don't think it's necessary. So I've done this a number of times in my own languages, and I've had unbelievable results. I have done this with loads of students that I worked with back when I was running my language company, and I've had so many readers of my book write to me saying how helpful this was and what a emotional sort of and mental relief it was for someone to tell them that they don't actually have to stop speaking their native language. They don't have to stop watching TV shows that they really enjoy in their native language. So that's why I say that I have seen this most effectively done when it's done gradually. So that brings me to discussing a couple of things that you can do to set yourself up for success and avoiding the language immersion burnout that we discussed. The first thing is make sure that you have plenty of content up front. And so, for example, if you're going to be changing all your podcasts to being in German, then make sure that you have a nice selection of those podcasts. I would suggest spending some time reading articles, like top 10 Spanish movies that you have to see, or 10 best Portuguese films of 2020. You get the idea. The point is, you want to make sure you've got a nice stockpile, because the worst thing is diving into an immersion bubble and then realizing that you don't actually have anything lined up. So that's the first thing, just make sure you've got loads of content. The second thing also relates back to the immersion burnout problem, which is I recommend switching one thing over at a time. So maybe you begin by saying, cool, I'm gonna switch my podcasting over to Mandarin Chinese. And then after a week, once I see that's going well, maybe 2 weeks, I don't know, maybe I will then switch all of my movies over to watching them in Mandarin. And maybe once a week on Friday night, it's time for the weekend, I'm gonna watch a Chinese film every single week. And maybe you decide that cooking is important to you, and maybe in the future, you would like to watch maybe cooking YouTube channels in Chinese. And so for the time being, you decide to start labeling sticky notes all over your kitchen, just so that you have the ability to constantly remind yourself of certain vocabulary words. And then maybe after a few more weeks, you decide, cool, now all my YouTube channels are gonna be Mandarin Chinese channels. Now I'm gonna focus on cooking channels. And like I said, this is simply to avoid that sort of going cold turkey burnout feeling where your body and your brain just sort of reject this new environment that you have forced yourself into. Now, finally, I want to give you just a few really nice advantages of doing immersion bubbles, because there are quite a few. The first one is that immersion bubbles really do make you a more confident speaker of a language. Now, for me, this issue of sort of confidence, or more specifically self-confidence, in language learning is a really complex issue. And I think that very often we assume that confidence in speaking a language comes from having the skills. But I think that's a very short-sighted view on self-confidence in speaking a language. Very often in other areas of life, people have excellent skills in any given activity, but they still might lack self-confidence. I personally have dealt with this my whole life, and I still deal with it today. Now, as I discussed when telling my story about the French Immersion Bubble, it really is quite amazing at the richness of sort of cultural context that you can build up and come to understand around a language or a country that speaks that language. And as it gets to the point where you start to recognize things, and maybe you read a story about something happening in that country, and you start to recognize and connect different data points, and you just start to feel, like I said, it's kind of like being an insider. And in my personal experience, you get this feeling that is very analogous to belonging. And I have found that the combination of sort of feeling like a bit of an insider and feeling almost like you belong in this community of people who speak this language, it really does help you to be more confident when you speak it. The second advantage is that immersion bubbles are wonderful for motivation. You can't avoid just like beginning to imagine all these different experiences that you're going to have in the future. It's hard to not imagine traveling to that one place, or maybe several places that all speak this language you're learning. And again, you look forward to using this rich cultural context that you have when you go to a place and when you get to interact with people who speak the language, because you're gonna know a lot of the references, you're gonna be able to talk about things that you have in common, things that you're all interested in. It's hard to not get excited about, using all of these skills and all this context that you're building up inside your immersion bubble. And I just think it's a wonderful thing for your motivation, especially carrying over long term. The final sort of advantage I'll mention is that you end up in this very nice positive reinforcement loop where essentially in the beginning, it can be quite difficult to stay in the bubble. So if you don't really understand Mandarin Chinese very well, then it's going to be quite difficult to continue listening to only Mandarin Chinese podcasts, especially if you kind of understand it, but it takes a lot of energy and it's a bit exhausting. But as you go through this process and as you start to improve your skills dramatically, well, it begins to be a lot easier to stay in the bubble because it takes a lot less energy. And so the longer you do this, the easier it becomes to sort of stay in the bubble, but it also becomes easier to switch from bubble to bubble. And so let's say you're learning several foreign languages. Well, you might decide I'm gonna do a German immersion bubble for the month of July. Then I'm gonna take a break and go back to normal and study different languages. But then perhaps in September, I'm gonna do a Japanese immersion bubble. And like I said, it becomes very easy to sort of context switch from bubble to bubble as you get more and more skilled at learning languages, but also as you get more experience living in these sort of micro environments that you create for yourself. And so immersion bubbles can be a wonderful tool for maintaining several languages over long periods of time. Okay, everybody, I hope that was helpful. I know that was a lot of information. I did my best to really think this video through and give it a lot of structure. So please let me know if you have any thoughts and if you would like to see more of these really structured videos, sort of tutorials of how to do a particular thing in a foreign language. All right, have a wonderful Monday, have a great new week, and I'll see you back here on Wednesday for the next episode.